And I'll be talking a little bit about effective cybersecurity with limited resources. Something that is on top of every security leader and CISO's mind is how do we make the most of what we have? And in some cases, when our budgets are staying flat or maybe even potentially decreasing. Now, the way that I like to deal with this is, in these types of situations, and actually even in more robust times, I like to always remind myself of first principles. Go back to those first principles in terms of thinking about how we need to set up and structure and think about what we're doing from a security program perspective overall. Now, some of the stuff that I'm going to be sharing with you, you might feel is perhaps a little bit of a reminder. That's kind of the definition of a first principle. But I find when we are distracted in the day-to-day, all of the daily emergencies that are coming up, all of the distractions at work, a lot of times we forget the common sense stuff. And what we get distracted by is we forget how to turn that common sense into common practice. And so that's what I want to talk a little bit about here today. Now, here, moving on, right, just from an introduction perspective, as Gal mentioned, I'm the CISO in residence at YL Ventures. Prior to that, I was the CISO at the SANS Institute. I've been teaching and writing classes with SANS for over 15 years. Still teach and write courses with SANS and specifically lead our cloud security curriculum and our cybersecurity leadership curriculum. Feel free to go ahead and connect with me, shoot me a note, connect with me on LinkedIn here at any point in time. I'll repeat this contact information at the very end of the presentation as well. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Now, if we take a trip down memory lane here a little bit, I started my career, it's been a long time ago, over 20 years ago, and I started my career as a developer, as an engineer, building applications and systems, and really sitting at my desk all day long in my cubicle and typing away. And I was as happy as I could be. I was focused on, well, building up my technical skills, using my technical expertise to, well, implement various controls. And well, I really had no idea what the rest of the organization was doing. And I really thought that, well, that was my job, right? That was my job to implement controls, build applications and systems more securely. And as I progressed in my career, I realized I took on more lead responsibilities, management responsibilities, leadership responsibilities, and so on. And eventually I had to, well, interact with senior leadership execs. It got cut off here at the very top of the pyramid, but that says executive. And I had to interact with more board members, CEO, CFO, COO, and so on. Come to realize that, hey, as you start to progress in your career, well, what becomes more important? It's not the technical knowledge, the technical implementation details. It's actually all about understanding those business objectives and what the organization as a whole cares about. And in fact, our job as security leaders, as security officers, as CISOs is not to implement security controls. Our job is to manage information risk. So our job, and it took me, to be honest with you, some time to figure this out as a technical professional. And really, our job is to understand what the risk is to the organization. Now, what do we mean by risk? Here on this next slide, let's go ahead and break it down into its most simple form. Now, we know that risk, every organization, even us as individuals, we face risk on a daily basis. This is talking about going back to the first principles here, is do I want to drive my car? Do I want to cross the street? Do I want to take the bus? There is some risk associated with getting in your vehicle every day. But the question is, well, what is the likelihood? And how likely is it to actually occur, something bad for it to actually occur? And what is the impact? What is the bad thing that could potentially happen to you? And here on the next slide, I find that it is useful to take a couple images here and conceptualize risk a little bit. Now, we talk about the impact and the likelihood. Imagine at the top of this little diagram, here you've got a big pool of water, but it's very shallow. What is the risk? What is the impact? Well, your shoes might get a little bit wet. Maybe you don't want your nice shoes or sneakers to get wet. But if you try to cross this long pool, well, you've got a very high likelihood that your shoes will get wet. So overall risk might be low. At the bottom here, we've got low impact and low likelihood. Well, you've got a small little pool, a puddle of water that you might easily step over, but sometimes, yes, I've slipped up and made a mistake and gotten my toe wet here as well. But what's more interesting here on the next slide is, what if you've got something that is low likelihood, but high impact. You've got a narrow gap there, but you've got some dangerous spikes down at the bottom. And this always reminds me of a hike that my wife and I took many, many years ago. And we were high up in the mountains and we came to a certain part of a particular peak. And it looked a little bit more precarious than it actually was. It was actually probably relatively safe, but there was a part where we had to make a short leap, maybe 2-3 feet or so across a little gap, a little chasm. And both of us kind of looked at each other after this long hike. We were tired and we said, what is the risk that we would slip jumping over this little 2-foot chasm? We felt it was a little bit too high. That was the equivalent of the big stakes at the bottom of this little passage. But what we typically think about and where we kind of turn our attention a lot of times is what is the worst thing that could potentially happen? What is high impact and high likelihood? You've got a wide gap here with spikes at the bottom. And when we've got this situation where there's potential high risk, where do our thoughts as security leaders naturally turn? Well, what compensating controls can I put into place? What processes can you actually implement? What controls can you implement to potentially create a bridge, some sort of bridge over this chasm to be able to successfully cross it to reduce the risk to your organization? And as we think about these basics here, these first principles, we need to take a step back and say, well, what is risk management overall? Now, some of you may be familiar with an organization called the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors. They're the group in North America here, like institutions around the world, the IOD Institute of Directors in different parts of Europe. And they advise, right, the boards of directors to say, hey, you need to make sure that your organization is treating cybersecurity not just as a IT issue, but treating it as an enterprise risk issue, just like all of the other risks that you as a board and the C-level executives are managing on a day-to-day basis. For us, as security leaders, we need to think, how does our program fit in? How does our program align with the various types of enterprise risk that we see here on the slide? Strategic risk, starting new business operations, perhaps as an example, in certain parts of the world. I've worked for some companies that have specifically said, look, we are not going to do business in China because of the geopolitical risk, because of the nature of our business, the nature of our clientele, nature of our customers, and as a result, we are going to strategically decide not to enter the Chinese market. Now, many other companies that I've worked with, they specifically do see the opportunity in China and say, hey, we are going to enter the Chinese market. So those decisions that are made from an overall strategic business perspective influence whether or not, right? Well, what we might want to think about from a security perspective. Similarly, we've got various financial risks. And this is, of course, really well highlighted by the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, but more recently, Silicon Valley Bank, other bank failures in terms of managing your financial exposure appropriately. Various operational risks, which we'll see some examples of here in a little bit, just by the fact that your business, your organization is operating day to day. There are some risks that come about because of those operations and corresponding legal and reputational risks as well. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, I'll ask you a rhetorical question here. Well, where is cybersecurity? Where is cybersecurity in this? How come security risk is not explicitly listed? Well, I would say that cybersecurity risk is cross-cutting across all of these things. And this is why it is important for us as the modern security leader to be not only aware and knowledgeable about all of the technical activities that our team is doing, not only aware of all of the tools and the capabilities, but yes, we need to put our business hat on and understand risk and compliance and strategic objectives of the organization as a whole. And so if we take a step back, earlier we mentioned, well, what is risk? Risk, any risk that an organization, a business that you might even face personally, is really made up of the basics, likelihood and impact. Now, what makes cybersecurity risk different though? What makes it unique? Well, this is where we further break down the likelihood component of risk into its constituent parts. Specifically, what is the vulnerability? Right? What is the weakness, the misconfiguration, the equivalent of the unlocked door, the broken window that you may have in your organization? But we also couple that vulnerability to get to the likelihood with the threat component, the threat factor. Is there a threat actor? Is there a threat agent that is potentially working to target your organization? whether it be organized crime, whether it be a nation state, whether it be a less advanced adversary. It's a combination of that vulnerability and threat that informs the likelihood. And this is what makes cybersecurity risk, I believe, different from other risks in the organization, is the combination of both of these factors. And of course, we've got to combine that with the impact. How bad could it be to the organization overall? So we mentioned this here in terms of these three different factors. Why? Well, because what is our goal? Remember, I said this at the beginning. Your goal as a cybersecurity leader, as a security leader today, is to manage information risk or to manage cyber risk. And why do we want to do this? Well, we want to reduce the impact of various incidents. We want to minimize the impact to the organization. Well, how do we go about doing that? Well, we try to get a better understanding of both the vulnerabilities and the threats that our organization may face to reduce that probability, to reduce the likelihood of those various incidents. All right. So this is the overall, in terms of the overall risk equation here. So based on this, what do we actually need to do? Let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about each of these three components. First, you've got your vulnerability. Now, what do you do to mitigate vulnerabilities, manage them a little bit better? Well, this is not too different from what I used to do, focus on 100% of the time in the early days of my career, right? Really thinking about, well, what do we need to actually implement? The good news is, for us as security leaders and practitioners, is that there are various frameworks out there, what I like to refer to as control frameworks. What are the list of ingredients that you could potentially implement in your security program or any security program? Here we've got one of the most commonly used security frameworks, which is the CIS, Center for Internet Security Controls. And you can see that these controls are divided up into 18 different control categories of varying technical requirements here that you may choose to implement in your organization. Now, the way that these CIS controls came about years ago, right, is that, well, hey, it used to be that, people would go around and do some red team activity and do some pen testing and identify a bunch of bad stuff. Well, Tony Sager, who used to be at the NSA a long time ago, at one point running the red team, would take all of these vulnerabilities they discovered and toss them over the wall to the blue team. And every single time they would do one of these assessments, they would find a bunch of bad stuff. And the blue team at one point got frustrated and said, Tony, hey, we need to figure out how to actually fix these things. And that was the genesis of the CIS controls, which over the years had input from many other agencies, enterprises, companies, industry experts, and so on, to come up with now the current version, the list of the top 18 controls that are shown to reduce the most amount of risk when implemented correctly. So if that's one element, right, of your risk equation, the vulnerability, now, well, we've got the threat component of this. And of course, the threat component, the de facto standard for understanding attacker tactics, techniques, and procedures, is the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Now you can see here, you've got at the very top the various tactics that an attacker might try to accomplish, like gaining initial access, code execution, maintaining persistence, escalating privileges, lateral movement, and so on. But mapped down along each of these different columns is the corresponding techniques. What does the attacker actually do to achieve their ends, those corresponding tactics? And by understanding real-world attacker activity, this helps us understand, well, what are the threats, right? Where might there be gaps in our coverage, in our detection coverage, in our prevention coverage, to better understand, well, what attackers are doing. So now we're getting a little bit of a fuller picture of the overall risk landscape here. Now, if that was vulnerabilities and the corresponding threats, remember the other big part of the risk equation is, well, you've got your corresponding impact. How bad could it be to the organization overall? Now, one of my mentors is a guy by the name of Steve Katz. Maybe some of you know him. Steve is known and regarded as the world's first CISO. He was the CISO at Citigroup back in the 1990s. And I've had many conversations with him over the years. And one of the things that he's repeated to me numerous times that always sticks with me, he said, Frank, there are no security risks. There are only business risks, right? Remember when we talked about the different types of enterprise risk earlier? Notice that I didn't say, we didn't have a box there that said security is a type of enterprise risk. I suggested that security is cross-cutting across all of those things. And this is kind of exactly what Steve was getting at here as well. In terms of there being no security risks, there are only business risks. And as a result, you, the modern security leader, need to understand, well, hey, where are those cyber risks? Really, what senior leadership wants, what the board wants from you is, well, your help in looking around corners and saying, hey, if we decide to take on this strategic objective, if we decide to make this financial commitment in this changing legal and regulatory landscape, these are the potential cyber-related risks that we might face as an organization. And oh, by the way, here's the plan, the strategic plan, the corresponding compensating controls that we could use, we could implement to mitigate those corresponding risks. Now, I have found here on this next slide over the years that I've got some version, some variation of a chart, a graph like this. And you can see that on the bottom part of this graph that you've got on the x-axis, you've got time. And over time, your business, your organization has invested in various technologies. Why? Not for the sake of investing in technologies in and of itself, although as a technologist, right, we might sometimes feel that. But why did the business invest in the first website, wireless network, mobile devices, big data, cloud computing, and of course now, the hot topic of the day, artificial intelligence? Why is the organization investing in these various technology capabilities? It is not to implement them, but is to achieve some business ends, some business goals. Now, what we're trying to illustrate here is by investing in these various technologies over time, naturally what is occurring? Well, operational risk is increasing within your organization. At the same time, what else is happening here? The threat landscape is changing. Now, this is an illustrative chart here. It does not precisely this timing, but over time, we do know that threats have gotten more advanced. You've got insider threats, you've got hacktivists, you've got ransomware, you've got organized crime, nation states, and so on, other specific examples. And the threat landscape is drastically changing, increasing over time, getting more and more complex, thereby, well, hey, increasing risk to the organization. And you implement new technologies, potentially introducing new vulnerabilities. Threat landscape is changing. The threat component is increasing as well. As a result, well, what's the bad thing that can occur? Well, yes, risk to your organization is increasing. Right? So this is how we want to frame it. Now, I have had other versions of this slide that has a third line on it. And the third line is usually below the green business line that is an illustration of the various controls that you have implemented over time as well. Friends and fellow CISOs that have used a similar version of this chart, and they've got a similar line in there as well to illustrate at a high level to senior leadership, well, what direction you are actually trying to go. All right, so we talked about risk, we talked about vulnerability and threats and impact. And Philip, thank you so much for the kind comment there. Now, the last slide, the second to last slide here, before we get to the last farewell slide, is we've got, how do we make this a little bit more concrete? This is where we talk about our vulnerability management process. Now at SANS, this is the vulnerability management process that we use. And if you were here earlier from the very beginning, and you saw Yaniv talk about, well, managing various stakeholders and the corresponding steps and process that you have to go through, this is not too dissimilar from what Yaniv actually talked about. And of course, we've got to start with preparation on the far left-hand side. Make sure that you've got the appropriate roles and responsibilities. You got buy-in, you've got policies and processes. And we also put asset inventory here in terms of the preparation phase. But you've got the identify phase, and the identify phase is where you might, of course, yes, identify, find various vulnerabilities by implementing and deploying various tools. But you, of course, you've got your mountain of tools, and I've been in environments where I've had millions of vulnerabilities, and well, you can't fix them all. So this is where you need to analyze that risk that we talked about, see if there's any compensating controls, prioritize, right, what you need to fix first, group various classes of vulnerabilities together, continuously along the way communicate what you're actually doing, whether you're meeting SLA or not, who needs to do what. Right? This is a very difficult job. And then you've got to treat, right? You've got to patch the vulnerabilities, implement various controls, and make sure things are actually remediated. Now, in the last couple minutes that I have here, I will ask you a rhetorical question. If you want, feel free to go ahead and chime in into the comments box. Which of these phases do you think is the easiest? Which of these phases do you think is the easiest? I will reveal my personal answer here in a moment, but feel free to go ahead and type into the comments box. Now, there is a phase that I think is both the easiest and the phase that is the hardest here. Now, I will say that the easiest, I believe personally, that the easiest phase is the identify phase, right? Why? Well, it's because it's relatively easy for us to buy a tool, buy a scanner, plug it in, click go, click scan, and get a mountain of vulnerabilities, right? That's why when we think about the risk equation, well, the vulnerability aspect of it is, do you have an open window? Do you have an unlocked door? Well, that tends to be, in my opinion, the easiest. The hardest phase here is the treat phase, right? In my opinion, the treat phase is the hardest because it's where the rubber meets the road. And similar to what Yaniv was saying, is this is the phase where you've got to wrangle all of the cats. You've got to get your stakeholders aligned. You've got the different stakeholder groups within the organization. And I see a number of different responses here in the chat. And, to be honest, I kind of, exaggerated for effect what is the easiest and the hardest. All of these things are actually hard. All of these things are very challenging. But remember, if you want to improve your security program, improve your security practices, kind of constantly remind yourself and the team, go back to those first principles of what is risk, vulnerability, threat, and impact. And then, hey, make sure you go ahead and follow your process here, whatever that may be, the nuanced changes from this, and make sure that you, kind of chip away every single day. Now, glancing back here at the comments, right? Kamal, thank you for that comment in terms of the CIS controls and mapping that to the MITRE attack framework. Appreciate it very much. Well, that brings us to the end of the session here. I want to thank you guys all for taking the time to attend. Feel free to go ahead and if you have anything you'd like to discuss, stay in touch, chat, feel free to shoot me a note. But, the best way would probably be to connect on LinkedIn.